Perfect. Thank you, Sembra. So thank you all for being today here, and thank you, Douglas, for accepting presenting here in Zoom. Like Sembra said, this is partly inspired by the Balkan River Defense Tour, the South Tour we were gonna do, but also with Douglas, we were gonna have this same lecture here in Munich in my university, in the Ludwig Maximilian Universität. So in the end, we decided to do it online. Actually, there are some classmates who are taking part in this seminar. So Douglas Sheil is a tropical ecologist from Ireland, based in Norway, and he works in the Norwegian University of Life Science. He specializes in forestry conservation, and is also a CIFOR senior associate. And he has published like in Science, Nature, among many other magazines, focusing mostly on rainforest conservation and local ecological knowledge and nature management. So today, Douglas will explain us about this relationship that he has been also been studying between forest and rain in broad terms. We don't have as much time as we normally would have, but if you have any question, then you can also send him an email later, or in other way contact him. Anyway, just for you to know, we will have like 20 minutes of presentation. Then I will do 2-3 questions that I had prepared for Douglas, and then it's open discussion for you all. And if during the presentation you have any question, you can write them down in the chat, and then we will discuss them with Douglas. So I now let Douglas talk and start his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll just check that you can all hear me clearly. Is it okay? Yeah, great. Yes. So let me try and do the share screen now. I'll turn you off because you're sitting on top of my PowerPoint. Okay, so the title of the talk, it's quite a lot to squeeze in today, but I'm going to try. So forests and water, advances and controversies. Yeah, so I want to talk you through a little bit why I have become really excited about this topic. And hopefully you'll see why it's more controversial than you might otherwise expect. Oh, it's not changing. How do I do that? The slide is not changing. Hang on. Yeah. So to start with, I want you to imagine a world where 2/3 of the people are suffering from water shortages, and where 500 million people are suffering from water shortages all year round. Now, if I told you about that, you're probably thinking, oh, he's going to be talking about climate change in 100 years or 50 years or whatever. But that's not the case. That's the world we live in now. Water shortages are a fact of life for the majority of the world's people. And I won't go into all the references. All the way through, you'll see references and things coming up. But there are references if you want to know about them. So water scarcity is a big problem around the world. And in my lifetime already, water scarcity is getting greater. The amount of water per capita worldwide has halved in the last 50 years. What are the consequences of that? Well, if you don't have enough water, it causes a lot of hardship. If you're talking about development, if you're talking about economic opportunities, it limits those opportunities, those developments. A lack of water leads to all kinds of environmental damage. You can think of those pictures of sand in the desert. You can think of those pictures of goats, etc. The environmental damage caused by water shortage. And if you're talking to politicians, I think something to really emphasize, it also leads to huge amounts of conflict in human migration. And even though these things are hard to measure, there's good evidence that that's the case, that shortage of water is a huge problem. So I principally work on trees and forests, and a lot of my career has been talking about the benefits of trees and forests, and you can think about what those are. There's long lists of the benefits to local people, for example, these pictures in Africa, shade, raw materials, etc. And you can think about the global benefits we all hear so much about, the benefits of a forest keeping carbon out of the atmosphere, improving the climate, all those species, all that biodiversity that the forests provide. But given that people are having a real problem of water around the world, what about the effects of trees and forests on water? And this is where it becomes suddenly much less clear. So I want to highlight one specific study. I'm a researcher, I'm a scientist, so I'm often talking about references. But there's a specific review that was published in the journal Science back in 2005 that was hugely influential. And a lot of people have heard of this study. So what this study did is it looked at 506 separate cases, 506 separate cases where people had a landscape without trees and then brought in trees, planted them, and looked at the effect on water. And in every single case, they saw a decrease in the amount of water coming off these landscapes, and quite a substantial decrease, between 33 to 44%. You'll see there is the sort of typical values. What we also saw in this summary, that in the drier sites, the effect was greater. In the drier periods, the effect was greater. So this seems to be pretty conclusive that really forests and trees are not compatible with wanting more water in a landscape. If you want more water, you should have less trees. And that's definitely the message that people took away from it. So there were news stories at that time, like in another scientific journal, there was a big news story, and they said, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, when you grow trees on croplands, you use more water. Even in magazines like The Economist, which is not a scientific journal, there was news stories, tree planting can exacerbate drought. And this is a message that a lot of people heard, and it was widely noticed. And it was quite a worry, because it really seemed to say that we have this conflict between trees and all the benefits that trees bring on one side, and the problems of water shortages on the other. How are we supposed to balance these? So going back to this study by Jackson et al., it's a huge study, 506 comparisons. But if you look in more detail, it may not be quite as convincing as it first looks, because only 2 of these locations are in the tropics. None of them were in the arid tropics. I work a lot in the wet tropics, also a little bit in the dry tropics. And even though there's 506 studies of this, all of these studies, except for 3, were looking at plantations of just 2 genera of trees, the eucalyptus and the pine. So maybe we should have some doubts about just how general this claim that trees use to deplete water is. And another point to make, here's a figure. It's harder to, can I point? Yes, I can point. So if we think about all of these comparisons, in each case, we're looking at a landscape with no trees. And here we're looking at, say, groundwater recharge. That's the water that's captured in the landscape, versus an area which is then reforested with dense tree cover. And we're assuming that any amount of trees will lead to a depletion of tree cover. And the idea there is trees use water, they emit it back to the atmosphere. They're a very effective way of emitting water back to the atmosphere. So more trees means less water. But perhaps this pattern is not quite all that it seems. And I have colleagues who I've worked with a long time who thought that perhaps the pattern could be more like this. The idea that actually infiltration, this is the capture of water in the soil, could be higher under trees. Of course, at high levels, evaporation has to be high, and we have to go down to these points. These are real data points, but perhaps it is not a linear relationship. And just the point to make, this has only been studied in detail in one site, and this is exactly what was seen. So the point here, let me point out. So the country was Burkina Faso. This is quite a dry land country in Africa, in the Sahel. The rainfall is quite low. You see here, the average rainfall is about 790 millimeters per year. A lot of the rain falls in heavy showers and runs away into the rivers and is lost from the landscape. The people who live in these landscapes are drawing water out of the wells, and the amount of water they're getting from those wells is declining. But they do have these tree cover landscapes. And the study that I was involved with in this landscape was looking at the effect of tree cover, not as zero tree cover to total tree cover, but looking at the spatial effect of tree cover in this landscape. And you see here this lower figure, canopy cover along the bottom. And we actually have 2 different responses here. You don't have to worry too much about this. It's just 2 different ways of looking at how the trees can interact. But we made measurements on lots of separate trees across this landscape over 3 years, very detailed data looking at how water travels through the soil profile. And the point to make here is that if we start off with the actual infiltration that you get with no trees in the landscape, that's about 10 millimeters per year, only 1 centimeter per year. But if you actually look at intermediate tree cover amounts. We can actually increase that quite dramatically. It doesn't matter, as I say, which curve you look at, you're getting 5 or 6 times more water. So the point is, this claim that was being made in this original study is not true. It was only that they were comparing 0 to total tree cover. But in this landscape, actually, the right amount of tree cover can increase the amount of water captured quite substantially. Okay, the main subject that Jens wanted me to talk about was rain, so I'll talk to you about rain. The main issue is not just about having adequate access to water, but the problem of when we have periods of too little water, droughts, and when we have too much water, floods, and the impact that can have. And again, this is causing hardship, it's limiting development, it causes all the problems we already highlighted from water shortages. But these are real problems. If you look at the newspaper on any day around the world, you'll see the problems that are caused by droughts and floods, and millions of deaths have been caused by these over the last 100 years. So I just want to go through some numbers with you, just to highlight where rainfall comes from. You probably know a lot about this already, but it's useful to do it. So the units on this figure, this is showing you the global water cycle, are in unusual numbers, thousands of cubic kilometers per year. So that's an unusual measure. So just to highlight some of the numbers here, the amount of rainfall falling on the global land surface is around 113,000 cubic kilometers per year. So where does that water come from? About 40 of that comes from the ocean. But the majority, so in this article, 73,000 cubic kilometers per year comes from the land surface. So you see that number is substantially more than comes from the ocean. Now, if you look at different studies, you'll find that there is some uncertainty around these numbers, but plus or minus 5%, these are pretty reliable. So most of the water that's falling as rain has already fallen as rain somewhere else, re-evaporated the atmosphere and is falling again. Now, it's not the same everywhere. So here's just a figure to try and highlight which parts of the world are really dependent on this rainfall that's recycled from the land surface. And the colors here, you'll see the scale on the right. Can I point? Yes. So the blue colors mean a relatively low percentage, up to sort of 20% is coming from the land surface. So that would be countries like Ireland, where I come from, or parts of Norway up here, which are blue. Up to 20% is coming back off the land surface. But these dark colors are showing where much higher proportion of the rain is coming off the land surface. And you'll see there's huge populations of people, for example, in China, where the majority of their rain is actually water that's fallen more than once on the land surface already. It's being evaporated and falling again. Also huge populations in Nigeria, Sahel of Africa, etc., dependent on this recycled rain. And even in parts of South America, if we look at even in parts of coastal Brazil, like Sao Paulo and Rio, which have had quite severe droughts in the recent years, you'll see that a lot of the rainfall they're getting is actually water that's been recycled off the land surface. And one of the things that we've discussed, I won't go into all the technical details behind this, but there's just good reasons to understand that most of this recycled water is actually coming from trees. This was not known until about 2013. Up until that point, people would have said maybe up to 25, 30% of the water that was recycled off the land surface was coming through vegetation. And then there was this startling result that was published in the journal Nature, which said it's more like 80 or 90%. And there's been some debate around the numbers, but the point is it's several times more than was previously understood. And this is something that is still a research topic. But this is just in the last 10 years that we've realized that instead of it being a very small fraction, plants are playing a very big role. And not just plants, but trees specifically are playing a very big role in this rainfall over the land surface. We know that forests are this amazing source of water vapor, and we have lots of data from around the world saying that when we lose forests, rainfall becomes less reliable. Sometimes there's more rain, sometimes there's less. Typically there's a decline, but sometimes we have more floods, etc. too. So it's not one answer. A study I've been involved in Borneo, for example, is relatively typical, and we see that over the last 50 years or so, we have a decline in rainfall that exceeds 20%. And we see a bigger effect in those parts of Borneo Island where the deforestation is worse. So we have quite good data telling us that there's a link, or a putative link, a correlation between loss of forests and a decline in rainfall, and also a decline in the reliability of rainfall. If we look globally, we find that the amount of water vapor being returned from the land surface to the atmosphere is also declining. And current estimates are about 5 or 6% decline in the amount of water vapor to the atmosphere. That's partly a result of deforestation. It's also partly a result of irrigation and all these other effects added together. The total is 5 or 6% decline. And perhaps we should be more worried about this number. A lot of the colleagues I talk with are always concerned about carbon, and everything's about carbon and forests and the effects on climate change. But if we think about this problem of so many people being short on water, and we see how land cover change has actually decreased the amount of water in the atmosphere, this decrease is actually quite substantial, 5 or 6% decline already due to human activities. So a little bit more on why forests are special. A typical tropical forest evaporates between 1 and 2 meters of water per year. So if you think that you can measure rainfall in a depth of water, you can also think about the water that's returning to the atmosphere as a depth of water. And it's typically about 1.5 meters per year for most tropical forests. Some cases much higher, some manage more than 2 meters per year back to the atmosphere. If you compare this with most low vegetation, open grasslands or crops, it's generally at least 3 or 4 times more than most crops. Interestingly, it's also more than open water. A forest per hectare is actually emitting more water back to the atmosphere than open water, like a lake or an ocean. It depends which water, it depends which forest, of course, but typically it's at least twice as much water is being emitted per day from the forest. Why are forests so effective at emitting water to the atmosphere? Well, you can think of it like why you put your clothes on a clothesline. The leaves on the end of the twigs of the trees are a bit like the clothes on the clothesline. That high leaf area up where the air is turbulent, it manages to emit water very effectively to the atmosphere. Why are trees special? I'm going to flick through this a bit because I don't think I can go into too much detail, but there's a long list of technical reasons why trees are able to put so much water back into the atmosphere. Infiltration we talked about earlier in the Burkina Faso case, but also the fact that there's a lot of water in the soils in many forests. Many trees have deeper roots and other vegetation, etc., etc. We could come back to some of these cases if you're interested in those. There's a lot of different technical details here, which I don't think I need to tell you in a 20-minute summary. Okay, so here's a nice relationship I just want to spend a little bit of time on. If we look at the world and we look at transects across the world, now look first at the lower figure. What we've done here is plot the distance inland. I think I have, yeah, distance inland along this axis on the bottom, and looked at how rainfall changes with distance inland. And then we fit these curves to data in different parts of the world. As we get inland, in many parts of the world, we get these declining patterns, more or less exponential, where the rainfall is decreasing the further we get from the coast. And that's more or less what you would expect with this idea of water being recycled, because every time the rain falls, some of it disappears out into rivers and can't recycle off the land surface. Some of it is captured by vegetation, whatever, and recycled into the rain, and maybe that's carried further in. But every time rain falls, you lose some to rivers. And that's pretty much what you would expect. But what you'll see here is if we look actually over forests, so that's line A, the Amazon, B, the Congo, or C up here in Siberia, at least seasonally during the summertime, we actually don't see this decline with distance inland. So this is an observation. These are data. This is not a theory. This is an observation. This is real. Why is that? Well, we have to think about how wind is carrying rain into continental interiors. If you're deep in the Amazon, how does rain get into you? Far from the coast. And this figure hopefully captures something most of you will have come across when you were at school, the idea that air moves across the ocean, picking up moisture, and as the land warms up during the day, the air over the land surface tends to rise. That brings a reduction in pressure, which draws in this moist air from the ocean. And as that air rises, any moisture in it can begin to condense with cooling. And that's why you get the wind bringing in this moist air, bringing the rain at the same time. It's the same reason that a hot air balloon rises, of course. This hot surface warms the air and that air rises. So it's basically driven by this temperature gradient, the idea that you have a cool surface and a hot surface, and the air is drawn towards the hot surface. And air always circulates, so this dry air has to circulate back. Now, hi? So I can hear somebody.
Yeah, I think somebody has his microphone on. Maybe Sembra, you could please turn it off.
It's
Sorry.
not bad to get some feedback because I'm talking to a totally silent room here, but you can hear me fine, right?
Yeah,
I probably tend to speed up because I don't hear any feedback. I wonder.
No, it's perfect. It's really cool. I think we are all enjoying this.
Okay.
Yes,
I'm not sure if I'm talking too fast or whatever, but hopefully we're okay.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, great, thanks. So this temperature explanation is also how we understand how the global circulation works, and it's obviously become more complicated. But since the 17th century, people have really understood that this is how global circulation works, that basically warmer parts of the world have rising air and colder parts of the world have cooling, falling air, and this creates circulation. It becomes more sophisticated and more complex when you think about how the Earth rotates, etc., but it's all driven by temperature. Just needed to highlight that. Okay, so this is really our understanding of how the global climate system works. And this is all the basis of these models that people are using to talk about climate change. They all include these kind of representations of how winds are carrying rain into continents and stuff, driven by temperature. And I just wanted to highlight a quote here from Stevens and Boney. This is back in 2013 when they published it. So these are two authors who actually write these reports for the IPCC. These are people who are actually telling what these predictions from the models are. They're making the models, running the models, and interpreting what they say. And they wrote this article in Science, What Are Climate Models Missing? And I'm quoting them because if I said it, it might sound like I'm being critical and being a climate change denier. So these are the people who actually tell you the climate change predictions. And they wrote that rainfall over land is largely determined by unresolved processes. And they said, this is the main limitation in current representations of the climate system. And they went on and said, this is a major roadblock to progress in climate science. So I think this isn't particularly well known, but the point is we don't really understand how rainfall works. So that's quite a shocker when you first come across it if you didn't realize. And I didn't realize. I come to this as an ecologist from outside. So we actually find that a lot of what's happening in the models with regard to rainfall is actually put in to make the models look real, but there's not real mechanisms behind it which provide convincing mechanistic links between land cover and rainfall. So that's just to say you know that. Okay. So a few years ago, I was writing a book on rainforests, and I came across this interesting idea that maybe forests attract rain. And if you work in various parts of the world, you'll find people believe this very clearly. So in parts of Africa, I've worked, people are very clear that forests attract rain. Parts of Asia, I've worked also, people say that this is the case. If you have a forest, it will attract rain. But if you talk to climate scientists, they disagree with this. There's no mechanism, there's no physical process. Now, I came across the work by these two physicists a few years ago at the same time. Hi, I can hear people.
Yes.
Is it okay?
So, somebody has its mic on again. Sembra, please.
Don't mind being interrupted, but it's fine.
I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. I just think people want to interrupt me. That's the problem. Okay, so I haven't got time to go into all the details behind their theory, but to me this is the really exciting idea, because they actually came up with a physical explanation, which I find coherent, and I think more and more people find coherent. And there's quite a lot of articles now in physics journals explaining this. It's been incredibly controversial. So I'm not going to go into all the details because we don't have the time. But just to explain to you why it matters, I sort of published a review on this about 10 years ago, trying to explain how important this was. But instead of being based on temperature, it's based on the idea that when water condenses, it leads to a lowering in the atmospheric pressure. And it's that lowering in atmospheric pressure that actually drives local winds. So here you see a picture, for example, of an ocean and a coast without forests. And you have evaporation. This is the vertical arrows pointing up. You have evaporation over the ocean here, which is higher than the evaporation from this low vegetation on the land surface. And overall, because water will tend to reach saturation point in the atmosphere over the ocean more frequently also you'll get condensation over the ocean, which will mean on average the wind will be drawn from the land towards the ocean. That's what the theory explains. If we do it with forests, this is reversed the other way. We actually get higher evaporation over the forest than over the ocean. So we'll actually see condensation happening more frequently over the forest than over the ocean. So that means on average, the wind will be drawn from the ocean more towards the land. So if you look at the physics, it will actually explain that these winds can be quite powerful, that they're a diurnal thing, because this transpiration, this evaporation from the forest is something that happens on a daily cycle. But when they're actually happening, they're very powerful. And what's nice is this theory is also powerful enough to explain how we can bring winds, for example, and rain into the interior of the Amazon and the Congo and Siberia. So the physics is actually very pleasing, and that it actually resolves why don't we get this decline in rainfall as we go into the interior over forests. It says it's not that the forest is a response to the rain, but that the rain is actually a response to the forest. So that's quite profound, and it has been controversial. I don't want to go into all the details of the evidence because we don't have time for that. But the two cases I just wanted to bring to your attention was it does explain this decline into the interior when you don't have forest, and why it doesn't happen when you do have forest. And if we look in this case of the transect in Siberia, it also explains why we see the pattern in the summer when the forests are transpiring. They're actually evaporating water to the atmosphere, but not in the winter when basically the forest, you can think of it having an off switch, the forest is turned off. It's not transpiring water. The ground is frozen. There's no water coming off the forest into the atmosphere. Okay, if I was giving a long talk and you were a technical audience, I would go into all the different evidence I have, because I'm always trying to convince people that this is a really important theory and a really powerful idea, because it really brings a whole new recognition, realization to how important tree cover is to actually maintaining these winds that carry moisture into continents, and also those rain that comes from that. It's also a powerful feedback. That means that if we lose the forest, we will lose that stability and resilience of the climate system. So the implications, I'm down onto the last 3 slides now. The implications, we see that tree cover is really important to maintaining rain, particularly deep inside continents. The implications of the physical theory, I'm sorry I haven't gone into detail, but you'll have to take my word. It really involves very powerful feedbacks. And the problem is if you break a feedback that's as powerful as these, it's like a switch. It can't be in an intermediate stage. It has to be on or it can be off. It tends to switch. So we can quickly go from a system which is wet to a system which is starting to degrade, say, with some fires. And suddenly you'll find you've gone from a wet system to a dry system. And that's pretty profound. But this is what the physics suggests could happen. Okay, so that's scary. The important stuff here, I think, is just to realize how important trees are to maintaining the water, recognizing that the losses can be catastrophic. But the positive stories are that we could also think about using trees and forests to actually bring water back to landscape. A lot of these insights I was telling you are really recent things. So recognizing how powerful trees are at helping to capture moisture, releasing moisture back to the atmosphere, and triggering these atmospheric flows that bring in water mean that you could actually think about growing trees and forests in areas that are currently even too dry for trees and forests. We just have to bring that moisture in the atmosphere back in to allow forests to re-water themselves. And again, the physics having this very powerful positive feedback means that we have these real opportunities to actually bring water to the people who need it. And I think this is such an important idea that even if people don't believe it's true, if they have even a small percentage doubt about it, I think it's a profoundly important idea and really needs to be taken into consideration. So this is what I'm often promoting these days. There's a lot of new knowledge about trees and forests in any case, but particularly this idea that trees and forests can actually bring water to people who need it. I think it's such a profound knowledge that we have, that we shouldn't keep working with misinformation. So I have written about some of these things in various places. One article I published a couple of years ago is reasonably easy, so I just give you this citation. I can pass it on later as well, or feel free to ask me. I'm always happy to answer questions. So I think I'll stop. I'm happy to take questions.
Well, that was short and sweet. Really good presentation, Douglas.
Thank you.
I mean, it's really hard task to condense so much information. Like you say, we don't know much about rainforest, rainfall, relationship, and yet there is so much to know. I will go, I have 1,000 questions, but I will go with 2 to 3 questions and we will open the discussion. Like the first question that comes immediately to my mind because of this relation we were talking about is then, in the Amazonas, for example, the Amazonas regions, the inland Amazonas region, without the Amazonas forest, what will happen in the inland? Will we still have rain, or that means what you are telling us that practically we wouldn't have rain at all in the inland of the continental South America?
If we just look at this theory on its own, it suggests that the rainfall would decline by more than 90%. So you really would switch from a wet to a dry system. But currently, even if you look at the global climate models that people are using, they also disagree on this question quite remarkably. You know, and it also depends what you have instead of forest. So in a sense, it's not a simple question. It's unlikely you would lose all the forest. It's unlikely you'll turn it into a parking lot. You know, there's always going to be some tree cover. So I think what's really scary in this theory, and I should say there's a couple of other theories that have been published in the last 2 years that are also saying kind of similar things, that there's these very powerful feedbacks which tend to make the system switch from being wet to dry. And there's an instability in the middle where it wants to tip one way or the other. It's not stable. So yeah, that's the real danger. You go from a wet system to a degraded system with fires, a few more fires, a few more droughts, a few more fires, and then you have a dry system. And that's really scary because it could happen quickly.
Also, there was this little technical, there are so many stuff about trees, but I think one interesting relationship is this, that trees emit like aerosols, these tiny particles that are related to clouds. Maybe you could explain a bit more about that particular relationship?
Oh, that would be a series of talks on its own.
Yeah,
it's incredibly complex because it's the size of the particle and the nature of the particle in itself has a huge influence. And what we see is that the particles over forests tend to be of biological origin, and many of them also change their properties due to the compounds released from the forests themselves. And it's a huge research topic, and there's a lot that's not known. But yes, we do see that forests are very effective at this, and we also see that these biological particles are very effective at this. So that's part of the role of forests in seeding rain. We call it rain seeding, or allowing condensation to happen. And one way to explain this is water tends not to like to condense when there's no surface. You can have what they call supersaturated water. Water vapor in the air will stay as vapor, will stay as gas if there's no surface for it to condense on. So as soon as you add a surface or a particle which has the right kind of surface on it, that allows water to condense, and it has a very big effect. So you can think of water being supersaturated. It might have almost twice as much water before it starts to condense if there's no condensation particles as if there is. So the forests are able to also influence that. Yeah.
Well, the implications of that are crazy. Like basically trees are related to clouds formation. The last question before we open this, we have discussed this through mails like a lot about the Gaia theory, Earth system theory right now. I believe like the implications sometimes of this topic are hard to grasp because they are so big. Like it's a tiny difference between like The earth has life because the earth has the right conditions. Two, the life is able to make these right conditions for life to thrive. It's tiny difference, and it's about Gaia in the end. So if I'm right, if I understand this right, this relationship between forest, rain, and evaporation and all these connections will mean that forests in a way are also able to sustain their own ecosystem. It's not that rain comes and a forest grows, right? So how would
That's
you
right.
explain that briefly to make the point, to make it clear a bit to people that maybe don't understand this relation that well?
Yes, it's a huge subject, so it's difficult to know which kind of short answer to give. But it's exactly what you said. The idea that biological systems, in this case forests, are actually able to maintain a system which is better for forests. So they're maintaining an environment and stabilizing an environment to keep it in the kind of keep it within the safety zone for a forest to expand and thrive. And my colleagues that I was telling about this, that came up with these ideas about this, what we call the biotic pump, this idea that the forest can actually draw in winds and rain, they also publish quite a lot on these Gaia ideas. I think the big problem for people to try and understand it, biologists to understand this, it's very hard to understand how the genetics works in these systems, because you would have any organism which cheats by not contributing to the greater good can often do better than one that doesn't cheat. So you have these like parasitic organisms that aren't contributing to the greater environment. And often it would seem in the equations that it's very hard to see what would make organisms want to benefit all the other organisms. But there are modern ways of looking at this, which I think are more convincing. And yes, it's still a research topic. That's not really not my research topic, because that's much more on the sort of evolutionary philosophy, almost, how these things arise. And that's where a lot of the trouble has been for Gaia theory, has been in this evolutionary theory. But I think looking at the system in the forest, it's definitely true that forests are good at keeping a living environment for forests, as long as we don't cut them down too much. What we also see is it's this large scale effect. And I think that's really the key point. You really need to have a big forest to actually have the right climate for a stable forest.
Well, that was also a really nice answer
Yeah.
to a big question. Juan Pablo has a question. Maybe, Juan Pablo, you could turn on your mic and ask yourself. Are you there, Juan Pablo?
Yes, hello. Hello.
We hear you.
My camera is not working. No,
Okay,
my question was, what are the chemical products of those aerosols? You know, and I understand that James Lovelock postulated that they are produced by algae in the oceans, some of them.
Okay. It's a very complicated thing. So it's not one chemical compound. I think there are several thousand of them, and that's been the problem. They're often being produced in really, really small amounts. There was an article published in one of these top science journals, Nature, a few years ago, where they were tracking the changes in, I think, about 300 or 400 of these different compounds over an orchard in California. So they're starting to have the technology to be able to see this. But every single one of those compounds was showing a kind of a pattern across the day and with the weather conditions. So there's incredibly complicated dynamics. And all these different compounds were being emitted by plants for different reasons. So good examples, I guess, like here where I am in Norway, there's a compound called pinene, which comes from pines. Yeah, there's different compounds that have been looked at. So pinene tends to be the most common in the boreal forest. No surprise, it's that nice piney smell, I think. So, but there's thousands of these different compounds. So it's not just one answer. So when you're talking about Lovelock, you're talking about this dimethyl sulfide that is emitted from algae, indeed, from the oceans. It's also emitted, we now know, from coral reefs. So not just the algae, but also the polyps. And that was a big surprise when people discovered that. And that's emitted to the atmosphere. And under the right conditions in the atmosphere, it creates tiny droplets of sulfuric acid, which are very good for helping raindrops to form. Surprisingly, it sounds like pollution, but it's very good for helping raindrops to form. Over the forest, it's other compounds. And the main one over the tropical forest is something called isoprene. which is like one of the little sort of monomers that you use for making rubber. So many, many different plants produce isoprene as a basic compound. And anyway, it creates these sticky particles that are good for ultimately for creating raindrops. But it's an incredibly complicated subject. Sometimes it also causes smog. So like with oil palm plantations around Malaysia, when you get too much isoprene coming off these oil palm plantations, it actually creates this horrible smog. And that's partly the product of the palm trees. So it is a complicated thing. It can actually contribute to pollution too.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know so much about Lovelock these days. That's not really what I'm studying so much. Yeah.
Thanks for the answer, Douglas, and then the question, Juan Pablo. So Thomas sent me a question by private message. Maybe, are you there, Thomas? It's a big question. Maybe you could ask it yourself.
Yes, I'm here. Do you hear me?
Thomas, David, and then Catalina. So you first, Thomas.
Great. Thank you, Douglas, for this incredible information. It's very useful for us here in Chile. And I have one question. Here in the central Chilean area, we are living a 10 years drought. And last year, with only 82 millimeters of rain, most vegetation below the 2,000 meters collapses. So this year, rains looks worse, and socio-ecosystems are transforming very quickly. I work in private protected areas that have ecosystem with water springs on the mountains where the water is born, very in relation with glaciers and snow. The only green areas that still exist are just near water courses or springs. And we are trying to enhance ecosystems that are maintaining water to start initiative of restoration and adaptation. Do you know information or practical tools that can give us some guide in this?
It's a good question in the sense that I think many people are facing similar constraints. I imagine there must be good practical guidance, but on the specific topic of water, I haven't really seen any kind of one simple formula that I could kind of just tell you as a soundbite answer. I think it would take much more looking carefully at the specific case, where the water is coming from, and which aspects of vegetation might be most beneficial to actually maintain water in that landscape. Whether it's about capturing more rain or bringing in more rain, or infiltration with bad, if your soils are degraded. So I would be a bit wary trying to give you a soundbite answer to that, because it's obviously a real problem and it needs a much more detailed review, I think, to give you a good answer for that. But my feeling is, of course, that vegetation will be an improvement. Obviously, those areas that were green in the past can be green again in the future. We just need to bring back what nature once provided, right? We know that we've disrupted something, but just to identify what it is in a specific case, I would be a bit wary.
Great,
thanks.
Thank you.
David also had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Jens. Thanks, Douglas. No, I was just wondering, since you mentioned this idea that forests are able to transport water from the ocean into the land, and normally rivers are seen as exactly the opposite. They gather water in the headstreams and transport it to the ocean, but also around rivers, the riparian corridor develops. So just a forested area around rivers. So does this also mean, in a sense, that, or would the number, in this case of forest, would be big enough for actually to allow the river to also transport water in the other way through this forest feedback? Or has this ever been studied? Or
this is all kind of cutting edge. It's all new thinking, I think. There's very few people have been looking at the biotic pump as this idea of forest drawing air in. I mean, it's getting more support, but none of the models that people are currently using include this mechanism. So one of the reasons I'm always telling people is I think it really needs to be included. But the colleagues I work with would think very much wherever you have a decline in forest cover, you will probably see a decline in rainfall somewhere. You may also see an increase somewhere else. The problem is you're disrupting these atmospheric flows. So you guys are interested in rivers. So we also need to be thinking about these rivers in the sky, because all that water is being replaced constantly to maintain those rivers. So you have to think about that return cycle in the atmosphere. What does that depend on? What controls where it goes? What controls how reliable that is? So if you're that farmer in China who's dependent on that recycled rain that's already fallen in several other places, all those steps could be where you're having a problem if you start seeing droughts. It could be any of those steps. So we need to think in that much more large-scale integrated way, I guess, to really understand what's going on. So maybe when you're losing forest around your catchment, it's not you who's going to lose rain, but maybe that Chinese farmer.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Everything is connected.
Exactly.
In a scientific way. There are two questions, Catalina and Bernhard, and I think then we will wrap up the session because we are coming to an end. So Kata, maybe you could start making your question, and then Bernhard, please.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for your talk. This was great. I think you already answered part of my question. But the first part is, like, how does the loss of tree cover affect like land by the coast so much? So you have said that the loss of tree cover inland really decreases the rainfall, but what about the coast that receives most of its rain from oceans?
Yeah, no, that's a really key point, actually. And generally, I would emphasize that so much because it's like a conveyor belt in a sense. If you break the conveyor belt, the water is not being carried inland anymore. The circulation system may become a local system over the land without actually connecting with that water input from the ocean. So it's like your river has to run the full length. If you break the forest right at the coast, maybe the water will stop coming in. So that is a danger we see. And again, it's reasonably simplistic in the equations so far. I'm working with physicists who make just equations of motion and look at kind of how they react with each other. They're not making full kind of sophisticated, complicated models. But we do see that this maintaining these feedbacks really requires more or less constant forest cover, or at least often people ask how much is enough forest cover. More than 50% forest cover right the way in. At the scale of kind of 100 kilometers across, you need big blocks of forest that are 50% or more tree cover. This is in wet parts of the world. In drylands, it will be different because in drylands, we would be trying to maintain what was the natural system there, I guess, previously, which is much more open, and that'll be different. But in these wet parts of the world, like South America or the Congo, we're really looking at maintaining large-scale tree cover right from the coast. And any major breach of that tree cover risks creating a circulation system which becomes local rather than continental. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bernhard?
Yeah, thanks, a great talk. It was really interesting. And I guess also my question was already partly answered by the previous ones. But I was also wondering about this, you refer to them as rivers in the sky or atmospheric rivers. If there has already been some research on that, if the course of these rivers that originate in the ocean would get changed by tree coverage, or also now by the large scale deforestation in some regions. Is there something that you can add to that?
There have been various studies. The problem at the moment, I guess, is how to put it, the behavior of the atmosphere is horribly complicated. And depending on which theorist or climate scientist you talk to, they will emphasize different issues and different controls. So at the moment, I guess that we're still in a debate as to what these dominant factors are. Obviously, I'm saying that this dominant factor, I believe it's tree cover. And I believe we have, several mechanisms. I've been emphasizing one that will determine that. And I think quite a lot of people also agree with that. But there's also quite loud people who don't agree with it. So we're still at the level of producing these research articles, I guess, trying to convince each other or arguing with each other. There's a colleague who works in Colombia, in South America, Germa Poveda, and he's written quite specifically on how atmospheric flows in Colombia have potentially been affected by deforestation, the effects we're talking about here. So he's somebody who's really looked at that in a very specific case. And there's also some nice studies in other parts of the world. For example, in in Western Australia, we see areas that have been deforested. We see the big decline in rainfall and cloud cover, and those have been quite well studied. So there are specific cases, but then how you interpret those would still be a matter of, yeah, debate. Climate scientists like to argue.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Last question from Natalie, and then we finish the session and we do our little wrap up. Anyway, if somebody has like a really big question or something interesting or some more technical to discuss, feel free to mail Douglas. He's a really cool scientist, and he will try his best to clear your question. So, Natalie.
Yeah, I was just wondering if this theory implies almost like a feedback loop and a pathway towards forest evolution. So in the west coast of North America, the Rocky Mountains create this rain shadow where there's a lot of rain, and then this is like a place of temperate rainforest. So is this kind of implying that this area maybe started something more like a deciduous forest, and then as it increased rain, it just like fed back and created this pathway to come to a more and more wet ecosystem?
That sounds plausible to me, but again, because the atmosphere is complicated, it's working at many scales. So of course you have to think about the large scale atmospheric movements as well. And in some cases, all you need is a mountain and you get rain and you have a wet site there. So I wouldn't want to say that's not the case. Sometimes we don't need to have anything too complicated to explain what we see. But definitely a site which has dense, extensive forest cover, we would expect it to actually create a wetter environment for itself. And I do think that's what we see. We do see this kind of dichotomy around the world too, where you have natural, sort of under natural vegetation, sort of closed vegetation, and much more dry land, open vegetation, and not so much in between. I mean, when we do see in between, it tends to be because of fire, human activity, and browsing animals. There's actually a tendency to have either dense forests or much more open environments. So I do think that we see that even the world is switching between these two kind of very specific cases, self-watering forests. And there's lots of evidence that I didn't manage to go into, but if you're interested, I could share that article with you, Jens, and then you could share it with other people if they're interested. But I think there's much more convincing evidence than I could show you.
Actually, I think Vera shared the article, but okay. we have a Facebook group where we will share also the article.
Great.
Yeah, I think those were really good questions, and well, you did an amazing job, Douglas. Thank you for taking the time, and also
thanks for the opportunity.
Interesting topic. Anybody interested on this? There, like we were discussing, there is this theory which is not updated, but there are like new science, like cutting-edge science, going through the questions that in the 70s were asked by James Lovelock, a really interesting scientist. Nowadays we have the biotic pump. Douglas Sheil talked a bit about that, but we also have like other theories concerning plankton and like these feedbacks on the ocean and many other incredible topics. So it's a really huge field that I think it needs more scientists. Just to remember you briefly, we still have our applications open for the Students for River Camp in Montenegro in September. And it will be nice if you can keep spreading the word, because we actually know it's going to happen because Montenegro is free of COVID. It's looking good. So we are looking forward to have a really interdisciplinary and multicultural group of students in Montenegro. So we will thank you if you can also share that information. And just to thank you all again. Thank you, Douglas. That was a really interesting talk. You did a really good job, like putting all together. There is so much to talk yet, but thank you all, and see you next Monday in the next Science Chat.